Explosion and Self-Destruct Defense Halving. Explosion and Self-Destruct were the most deceptively powerful moves in early Pokemon generations due to a hidden mechanic that made them twice as strong as their displayed power suggested. When these moves calculated damage, they secretly halved the target's defense stat before applying the attack. This meant Self-Destruct, which showed 130 base power, actually dealt damage equivalent to a 260 power move. Explosion, displaying 170 power, functionally hit with 340 power. In Generation 2 and beyond, Game Freak increased the displayed power values to 200 for Self-Destruct and 250 for Explosion, but the defense halving mechanic remained intact. This created moves that effectively had 400 and 500 base power respectively. To put this in perspective, the strongest regular moves like Hyper Beam only reach 150 base power. These explosive moves could one-shot nearly any Pokemon, even those with massive defensive stats. The defense halving applied before any other calculations, meaning it worked against Pokemon with boosted defense stats as well. A Pokemon that had used Iron Defense multiple times would still have its defense cut in half before the explosion damage was calculated. This made defensive strategies largely useless against these moves, as even the bulkiest Pokemon could be eliminated in a single hit. Hyper Beam No Recharge Exploit. Generation 1 Hyper Beam contained a programming oversight that transformed it from a risky high-power move into the most broken attack in competitive Pokemon. The move was designed to require a recharge turn after use, but this restriction was bypassed if Hyper Beam knocked out the target Pokemon or destroyed a substitute. This exploit allowed players to chain multiple Hyper Beams consecutively without any recharge penalty. With Stab, which is the same type attack bonus, normal type Pokemon could fire off 225 effective power Hyper Beams repeatedly. Since Generation 1 only had rock types that resisted normal moves and no Pokemon were immune to normal attacks, virtually every Pokemon in the game was vulnerable to this strategy. The most devastating users were Pokemon like Tauros and Persian, which combined high speed stats with access to Hyper Beam. These Pokemon could outspeed most opponents and begin a Hyper Beam chain that would continue until the entire opposing team was eliminated. The only counter was to use a Pokemon bulky enough to survive the first Hyper Beam, but even then, the attacker would simply recharge once and resume the chain. This mechanic single-handedly warped Generation 1 competitive play around normal type attackers and the few Pokemon capable of surviving their assault. Teams were forced to carry specific counters or risk being swept by a single Pokemon using this broken interaction. Critical Hit Speed Dependency. Generation 1 implemented a critical hit system that created massive imbalances between different Pokemon species. Instead of giving all Pokemon equal critical hit chances, the game calculated crit rates based on each Pokemon's base speed stat. This meant naturally fast Pokemon had dramatically higher chances of landing critical hits compared to slower species. Electrode, with its base 140 speed, achieved a 27.34% critical hit rate on every attack. Meanwhile, Snorlax, with base 30 speed, only had a 5.86% chance. This disparity meant fast Pokemon like Persian and Tauros landed critical hits roughly once every 4 to 5 attacks, while slow Pokemon might go entire battles without a single crit. The system became particularly broken when combined with high-power moves like Hyper Beam. Persian and Tauros, both with approximately 22% critical hit rates, could land critical Hyper Beams that dealt massive damage while bypassing the recharge turn if they secured a knockout. This created a scenario where fast Pokemon had both higher damage output with more consistent performance. Critical hits in Generation 1 also ignored stat modifications, meaning a Pokemon that had boosted its defense multiple times could still take full damage from a critical hit. This made defensive strategies unreliable against fast attackers, as they could bypass defensive boosts through sheer critical hit frequency. Electric-type paralysis vulnerability. For 5 generations, Electric-type Pokemon suffered from an inexplicable design inconsistency regarding status conditions. While Fire-type Pokemon were immune to burns and Ice-type Pokemon couldn't be frozen, Electric types could still be paralyzed by non-electric moves. This created situations where Zapdos, a legendary electric type, could be paralyzed by a normal type move like Body Slam. The inconsistency became more apparent when considering that electric type moves like Thunder Wave couldn't paralyze electric type Pokemon, but physical moves with paralysis chances could still affect them. This meant that while Zapdos was immune to Thunder Wave, it remained vulnerable to Body Slam, Lick, and other moves that could inflict paralysis through secondary effects. This vulnerability was particularly problematic for Electric-type Pokémon because paralysis reduced their speed by 75% in early generations. Since many Electric types relied on their high-speed stats for competitive viability, paralysis effectively crippled their primary advantage. Pokémon like Jolteon and Electrode, designed around speed-based strategies, became sitting ducks when paralyzed. The issue persisted through Generation 5, affecting the viability of numerous Electric-type Pokémon in competitive play. Players had to account for this weakness when building teams around Electric types, often requiring additional support to prevent paralysis or ways to cure it quickly. Permanent Freeze status. Generation 1 featured the most punishing status condition in Pokémon history: Freeze. Unlike other status conditions that had chances to wear off naturally, frozen Pokémon had absolutely zero chance of thawing out on their own. Once frozen, a Pokémon remained in that state indefinitely unless specific actions were taken to cure it. The only ways to cure freeze were using items like Ice Heal, the move Rest, or being hit by a fire-type attack. This created scenarios where frozen Pokémon were effectively knocked out if the opponent lacked fire-type moves or if the player had no healing items remaining. In competitive battles without items, freeze often meant permanent removal from the battle. Ice-type moves like Ice Beam and Blizzard had 10% and 30% freeze chances respectively, making them incredibly dangerous beyond their base damage. Articuno became particularly feared because it could potentially freeze multiple opposing Pokémon throughout a battle, gradually reducing the opponent's team to unusable status. The permanent nature of freeze made it more devastating than any other status condition. Sleep lasted a maximum of 7 turns, paralysis and poison could be played around, but freeze was a death sentence. This led to Ice-type moves being valued not just for their damage, but for their potential to completely remove threats from battle. Binding move paralysis. Generation 1 binding moves created some of the most frustrating and broken interactions in Pokémon history. Moves like Bind, Wrap, Fire Spin, and Clamp didn't just trap the target, they prevented both Pokémon from taking any actions for the duration of the effect, lasting between 2 to 5 turns. The most broken aspect was that faster Pokémon could chain these moves indefinitely. If a Pokémon successfully used Wrap and was faster than its opponent, it could use Wrap again as soon as the first one ended, creating an infinite loop where the opponent never got to act. This strategy was particularly devastating with Pokémon like Dragonite, which could trap and slowly defeat much stronger opponents. All subsequent hits during a binding sequence used the same damage calculation and critical hit status as the first hit. This meant that if the initial Wrap was a critical hit, every turn of damage would be critical. Conversely, if the first hit was weak, all following hits would also be weak, but the opponent still couldn't escape or retaliate. The binding effect also prevented the trapped Pokémon from switching out, using items, or taking any action whatsoever. This created scenarios where entire battles could be decided by a single successful Wrap, as the trapped Pokémon would slowly lose all its health while being completely helpless to respond. Toxic and Leech Seed Synergy. Generation 1 contained a programming error that created the most mathematically broken damage combination in Pokémon history. When a Pokémon was affected by both Toxic and Leech Seed, the two effects shared the same damage counter, causing exponential damage scaling that quickly became unsurvivable. Toxic normally dealt increasing damage each turn, starting at 1/16 of max HP and increasing by 1/16 each subsequent turn. Leech Seed dealt a flat 1/16 of max HP per turn while healing the user. However, when both effects were active, Leech Seed used Toxic's escalating damage counter instead of its own fixed amount. By turn 5 of this combination, the affected Pokémon would lose 17 out of 16 of its maximum HP per turn, while the opponent healed for the same amount. This meant the victim lost more than its entire health bar each turn, while the attacker gained more than a full heal. No Pokémon could survive this combination for more than a few turns. The synergy was most effectively used by Grass-type Pokémon that naturally learned both moves or could learn them through TMs. Pokémon like Venusaur could set up this combination and then simply wait for the opponent to defeat itself through the escalating damage. The only counters were Pokémon immune to either poison or Grass-type moves, or switching out before both effects were established. Toxic Accuracy Bypass Exploit. Generation 6 through 8 contained a programming oversight that allowed Poison-type Pokemon to achieve perfect accuracy with any move for an entire turn after using Toxic. This occurred because Poison types gained perfect accuracy specifically for Toxic, but the game incorrectly applied this accuracy boost to all moves used during that turn. The exploit became particularly broken when combined with the move Instruct, which forced the target to repeat its last used move. Players discovered they could have a poison type use Toxic for a guaranteed accuracy, then used Instruct on a Pokemon that had previously used a one-hit knockout move like Horn Drill. The OHKO move would then execute with perfect accuracy instead of its normal 30% hit rate. This interaction allowed players to guarantee instant knockouts against any Pokemon regardless of level differences or defensive stats. Horn Drill, Fissure, Guillotine, and Sheer Cold all became 100% accurate when used through this exploit, completely breaking competitive balance. The glitch remained unpatched for over a year, during which time it was banned from all competitive formats. Game Freak finally addressed the issue in Sword and Shield, but not before it had significantly impacted online battles and tournaments where players discovered and abused the interaction. Chatter Voice Recording. Generation 4 and 5 featured the most unique and problematic move in Pokemon history, Chatter. This flying type move allowed players to record audio through their device's microphone, with the volume and content of the recording determining the move's confusion chance ranging from 1% to 31%. The mechanic encouraged players to record loud sounds or shout into their microphones to maximize Chatter's effectiveness. However, this created significant problems in competitive play, as players began recording inappropriate content, offensive language, or disturbing sounds that would play during battles. Tournament organizers faced an impossible situation. They couldn't monitor every Chatter recording, but allowing the move meant potentially exposing players to inappropriate content. The move was quickly banned from all official competitive formats, making it the only move ever banned for reasons unrelated to game balance. The volume-based confusion chance also created inconsistencies in the move's effectiveness. Players with better microphones or who were willing to shout loudly gained significant advantages over those using standard equipment or playing in quiet environments. This made Chatter's power dependent on external hardware rather than the game mechanics. Despite being an interesting concept that utilized the DS's unique features, Chatter represented a failed experiment in interactive move design. The move was eventually reworked in later generations to have a fixed confusion chance, removing both the recording feature and the associated problems. Double Battle Forced Switching. Generation 3 Double Battles contained a devastating mechanic that could cause cascade failures, resulting in multiple Pokemon knockouts in a single turn. When a Pokemon fainted in a double battle, the player was immediately forced to send out a replacement with no option to decline or leave the position empty. This forced switching created scenarios where spread moves like Surf or Earthquake could eliminate multiple Pokemon consecutively. If both of a player's active Pokemon were knocked out by a spread move, they would be forced to send out two replacements, which could then be immediately knocked out by the same Pokemon using another spread move. The mechanic was particularly brutal in Pokemon Colosseum and XD, where AI opponents frequently used powerful spread moves. Players could lose their entire team in a single turn if they didn't have Pokemon capable of surviving the opponent's spread attacks. This made double battles significantly more difficult and unpredictable than single battles. The lack of a no-target option meant players couldn't strategically leave a position empty to avoid further damage. Even if sending out another Pokemon would result in its immediate knockout, the game forced the replacement, often leading to unnecessary losses that could have been avoided with better switching mechanics. Haze does everything. Generation 1 Haze was the most overloaded move in Pokemon history, performing 12 different functions simultaneously. Beyond its primary effect of removing stat changes, Haze also eliminated Light Screen, Reflect, Leech Seed, Confusion, Sleep, Paralysis, Poison, Burn, Freeze, and several other effects. The move's extensive functionality made it a universal reset button that could undo almost any strategy or setup. Pokemon that had spent multiple turns boosting their stats, setting up screens, or inflicting status conditions could have all their work undone by a single Haze. This made the move incredibly valuable, but also frustrating to play against. Haze's interaction with other Generation 1 mechanics created even more broken scenarios. When combined with the Hyper Beam exploit and Permanent Freeze, Haze could create situations where opponents became permanently helpless. A Pokemon could be frozen, have its stat boosts removed by Haze, and then be hit by Hyper Beam repeatedly without any chance of recovery. The move's broad functionality also made it unpredictable for opponents. Players using Haze could remove beneficial effects from themselves if they weren't careful, but they could also instantly cure any negative status conditions or stat reductions. This versatility made Haze one of the most powerful utility moves ever created. Badge Boost Stat Modifier Chaos. Generation 1 contained the most game-breaking mechanic in Pokemon history through its badge boost system. Each gym badge provided a 12.5% boost to specific stats, but due to a programming error, these boosts were reapplied to all stats whenever any stat was modified during battle. The glitch meant that using a single stat boosting move, like let's say Harden, would trigger badge boosts to be reapplied to attack, special, and speed stats as well. A Pokemon with all 8 badges would gain 12.5% boosts to multiple stats from a single defense boosting move, creating massive unintended power increases. The most broken application involved low-level Pokemon with access to stat boosting moves. A level 5 Metapod could use Harden repeatedly, gaining speed boosts that would eventually allow it to outspeed end-game Pokemon. Each use of Harden would reapply badge boosts to all stats, creating exponential growth in the Pokemon's capabilities. Status conditions that reduce stats would also trigger the badge boost reapplication, but in reverse. A paralyzed Pokemon would have the speed reduction reapplied every time any stat was modified, creating scenarios where Pokemon became progressively slower throughout battle. This made status conditions more punishing than intended and created unpredictable battle outcomes. The badge boost glitch affected every battle in the main story campaign, as players naturally acquired badges throughout their journey. This meant that late game battles operated under completely different rules than early game encounters, with stat modifications having far more dramatic effects than the game's designers intended.